Every day, millions of hours are spent commuting to and from work. One study I recently read was that the average San Francisco resident spends 230 hours commuting between home and work each year. And for San Francisco, that equates to 500,000 hours of productivity lost each day. So on-demand urban air mobility certainly has potential to not only create rapid and reliable transportation between cities, but also inside of cities, and that's going to really help improve productivity. But like everything else we've talked about today, there's going to be challenges. Some involve technology, for example, batteries, vehicle efficiency, performance, reliability, and there's certainly cost and affordability challenges. Safety, noise, emissions, certification, air traffic control, these are some of the things and more that you're going to hear about from our panel this afternoon. So to start things off, I'm going to turn things over to Mr. Lowell Foster. He's the Director of Global Innovation and Engineering for the General Aviation Manufacturers Association, or GAMA. Now, Lowell's fairly new to GAMA. He just joined the organization last month, right? And after he had a very distinguished career with the FAA, primarily in the small airplane standards branch. He's also has experience as a flight test engineer with the Mooney Company. So, Lowell, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Terry. Thanks and welcome. Today, what I want to do is introduce our panel members here, and then I'll do it one at a time, and I'd like them to share with you just a few minutes of kind of their take on urban air mobility in this market space. And then when we get to Mike, Mike's going to ground us with a couple slides, kind of to set the stage for today's questions and discussion. So with that, I'd like to introduce Greg Boles. Greg is head of government affairs for Joby Aviation, engages key policymakers to expedite the introduction of new generation of air transportation that's safer than driving and is so cost effective it'll be part of our daily lives. For almost 2 decades, Greg's been working in regulation and policy to foster worldwide safety and success in the aviation community. During this time, he championed efforts to reform thousands of regulations, including global changes governing the design of general aviation aircraft. Previously, Greg worked as the VP of Global Innovation and Policy for the General Aviation and Manufacturers Association. Prior to joining GAMA, Greg worked for rotorcraft and airplane manufacturers in advanced design and regulatory roles. A native of Connecticut, Greg holds a Bachelor of Science degree in Aerospace Engineering from Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University and an MBA from Webster University. He's an active pilot and he's based here in Washington. And Greg, maybe a couple minutes on your take.
Absolutely, thanks, Lowell. So I'm very familiar with Lowell's role because I was fortunate to pull Lowell into GAMA as I left GAMA. So it's awesome to have you there on the team at GAMA. I also really appreciate all the work and discussions we're doing here at RTCA. There are some really critical things that have been created, some standards that have been created in the past, and we've got a lot of work to do as a group, so hopefully we can talk about that as a panel. What I'll say from the perspective of Joby, our company is developing an electric aircraft, an electric airplane, with the intent of saving people lots and lots of time. We focus on 3 things at Joby. The number 1 is safety. The first thing we focus on is safety. The second thing we focus on with our aircraft is noise. And the third is efficiency or cost effectiveness. And that's actually partially to get at that second issue of noise. We know there's a lot of what we call virtual noise. So folks are concerned about the kinds of aircraft that bother them is because they're not necessarily part of it. So sometimes if things can be part of your daily life, you don't dislike it so much when your neighbor's using it as well. So those are the 3 principles, and I look forward to talking a bit more. We'll pass it over to my colleague, Doug.
All right. So Douglas Davidson. Doug is Innovative Executive Director for Operations and Support of Embry-RX. Trained as a classical scientist, Doug followed his passion for aviation after leaving medicine and in doing so, brought an intercontinental business jet to market, and has built up and run several global product support organizations. And as a charter member of the Embraer X Accelerator, one of his latest roles is responsibility for the development and implementation of support infrastructure and operations of their EVTOL program. Doug.
Well, thanks, Lowell, and good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for spending time with us. This is my first RTCA foray here, and I'm humbled by the presence and the knowledge that's in this room. So thanks for sharing your insight with us. Embraer X is an accelerator. It's a division of Embraer, and our goal is to make people's lives more productive and fun. I mean, we've been moving people safely for 50 years now, and we look to continue that, even though technology and methods are changing. So we're very excited about what urban air mobility brings, whether it's a variety of different technologies and hardware, and we look at it from a holistic view. So whether it's infrastructure or operations, the vehicle itself, how we support the vehicles, and the air traffic network that's going to make this work, we're very, very interested in that. We've been doing this for quite a while. So I'm looking forward to the panel discussion here and getting your thoughts as we go along. Thanks for having us.
Thanks, Doug. So next on our panel, Bill Goodwin. Bill is head of the policy and regulatory team and was first legal hire at Skyrise, a startup enabling the future of urban and autonomous aviation. Previously, he was first lawyer and general counsel at AirMap, a tech company architecting the future of low-altitude flight, where he headed the legal and policy teams. Prior to AirMap, Bill was an attorney in the San Francisco office of Morris & Forster, with a split practice of commercial litigation, tech transactions, and regulatory counseling. He was part of the Morris & Forster UAS practice group, providing practical and strategic counsel on the unique product liability licensing and regulatory risks that arose in the drone market. Maybe a couple minutes, Bill.
Sure. Yeah, I would love to tell you a little bit about Skyrise. We are the world's first end-to-end transportation service with flying in the middle. So that bit about San Francisco resonated with me. I did have one of my best commutes on the BART in San Francisco, but by best, I mean it was 70 minutes door to door, I believe. Now I'm back in Los Angeles, where Skyrise is based, and my commute is the best it's ever been in Los Angeles, which is 80 minutes door to door. So it's things are really looking up on my end. I do think I'd love to be a consumer of Skyrise's service, and I'll tell you a little bit about why it's different. The urban air mobility industry is in a unique place where there's this complementarity between folks who are building the platforms of the future and the fact that we already have an enormous infrastructure and a lot of tools and vehicles and pilots who can actually perform the mission of urban aviation. And a lot of the reasons that urban aviation hasn't come to pass are candidly known, and they're hard problems. And there's different ways of solving them. I think Greg already alluded to the fact of noise as one of the preeminent ones, and the fact that they're baking that into their hardware, into the vehicle that they're building. And Skyrise has to approach that from a different perspective, because we're building a service first and a technology stack that will support that, but that means that we're flying existing helicopters on existing routes into existing takeoff and landing locations and dealing with the existing communities. So we have some pretty creative ideas about how we can perform that service and integrate urban aviation into the market today in a way that will allow us to actually scale as some of the EVTOLs of the future come and help solve the problems that we're only going to be able to partially solve today. So that, I think, is a unique perspective that we have relative to everyone else. And the way that I love to position urban air mobility so we don't get too far into the future and think too much about purely flying cars or some of the other wilder things you may have heard, is that today I commute in Los Angeles, and who here has ever had Burger King chicken fries? I'm getting a no. Okay, well, unfortunately, you're not going to be able to take advantage of a service that Burger King is launching in LA this year to deliver by motorcycle their products to your car window, because congestion is so bad that people in traffic will be able to order Burger King to their car. I use that example because you don't have to suspend your disbelief to believe in urban aviation. We're already in a fantasy land when it comes to the impacts of traffic on places like Los Angeles. And something like using the existing infrastructure, using existing helicopters to perform missions that save people time and free them up to move around their cities, that's far less fantastic and absurd than some of the things that we're seeing today.
And our final panelist is Mike Nichols. Mike, a certified aviation manager and certified association executive, is Senior Vice President of Strategy and Innovation for the National Business Aviation Association, NBAA. He leads the NBAA division charged with creating opportunities for emerging technologies relevant to business aviation, such as the urban air mobility EVTOL space, providing innovative strategies, perspectives to enhance existing programs, products and services, and promoting a culture of innovation and entrepreneurship within NBAA. He is an aircraft owner and an instrument-rated pilot for land and seaplanes. And
all right, thank you very much.
Mike's gonna baseline us.
So thank you to RTCA for putting this panel together. And Lo, you've done a great job getting us organized, and looking forward to the dialogue we're going to have today. And I think I'm going to stop complaining about Washington, D.C. traffic after hearing what Bill goes through in San Francisco than in L.A. So EVTOL, if the slides can come up, EVTOL is one of the hottest topics that is facing, or the business aviation industry and the broader aviation industry is engaged in today. It's a pretty exciting topic because of advances in technology such as avionics, autonomy, electric motors, combined with the increased congestion on roads. So when you have this convergence of these two challenges, the technology combined with the challenges, urban air mobility is certainly something that is a hot topic. And that's led firms like Morgan Stanley to do some research in this area, and shockingly, they have projected that the market for, as they described it, self-flying cars could rise to $1.5 trillion by 2040. When I first read that, I thought that was a typo. I thought that can't be by 2040, but that's what they've projected. And then consultants Market also analyzed the sector and identified the market size as a little bit smaller, $5.3 billion in 2018, but projected to rise to over $15 billion by 2020. And NASA, which has been a leader in urban air mobility, has done some research as well and projects 750 million annual passenger trips in 30 metropolitan areas by that year. So that's pretty impressive considering where we are today in 2019 for something that there have been some operations, some flying, a lot of testing going on, a lot of designs, which we'll talk about, some of those, but yet there's nothing in commercial operations today that's in the category of EVTOL. Skyrise obviously is looking at solutions using existing technologies. He'll talk about that a little bit more, which is pretty exciting for the industry. So with 160 EVTOL programs under development, and I used to say about a new program every week. Now it's like a new program every single day. And I would also point out that I'm not an engineer, I'm not a scientist, but my friends who are say not all of them are going to be viable. They're really cool designs. We might learn something from the development, the testing that could be incorporated into other programs, but I don't think that by 2030 we're going to see necessarily 160 different EVTOL models that are going to be flying. Longtime aerospace companies like Bell, Airbus, and Embraer have active programs. Also early innovators like Joby, Lilium, and Terrafugia are hard at work, and then dozens of other companies are working on these programs. Companies that you and I have probably never heard of before, but if we look at the resources that are out there, the media companies that are reporting on them, there's a lot of excitement around it. And one of the things that I really find attractive is that the companies are focused on sustainability, efficiency, seamless transportation from point A to point B, and doing that in a cost-effective manner. So from business aviation's perspective, we're certainly excited about urban air mobility, particularly if you're a company that's invested in an asset, a business aircraft, a time machine, and that time machine sits at an airport that may be, 15 miles away, but with traffic could take 70 minutes, 80 minutes, longer. That time machine has become less effective and less relevant. With this exciting new potential technology, that creates an opportunity for that time machine to really add greater value for the company. So there's certainly some synergies there. The road to full urban air mobility integration, as we're going to talk about, will have some bumps, and we'll discuss a lot of these in some level of detail, including basic physics, science, global standards development, which RTCA has a significant role in that, airspace integration, regulatory environment, infrastructure development, and I think probably one of the most important for this market to reach what the forecasters have projected is public acceptance.
Thanks, Mike. So we've got some questions that we're going to use to generate some discussion. Part of me wants, already got a question?
I have a comment.
Yes.
Last weekend we said that all electric powered gliders would not be able to plug in to recharge their batteries at our system because they did plug one in and it blew our system apart. We're a self-generated battery photovoltaic generator, and so there's obviously a compatibility problem between, and those are European gliders, motor gliders mostly, so there's a compatibility problem. So I wonder if that's been resolved in the broader world than the small world of gliding electric-powered aircraft.
So I'd say we'll
That's
roll
a
that in.
fantastic cue
Yeah.
line. Thank you for
Yeah.
setting that up.
Especially
So I think
for,
I owe you $20 when we get out of here, right?
set up for standards.
Yeah. So
The need for standards.
So one of our questions that we were going to discuss is the need for standards and standardizing standards across different bodies. We've got RTCA, SAE, ASTM, and these all play an important role. But making sure that we stay harmonized globally so that things work when you want to do something as simple as plug them in.
European voltage is different than ours, but that's,
Just a little.
That's not the compatibility problem. We
Right.
took that into account. I don't know the details. I didn't realize you guys were going to be talking hydroelectric here, and I didn't bring any details with me. But last weekend we said no more till we figure out what's going on.
So when we started the questions, we were thinking standards that were important for, say, vehicle to vehicle or vehicle to ground type communications, datacom, that type of thing, which is important. And do we see a need for organizations like RTCA and EuroK to come in with standards to help with that? But I think your point's really good, and maybe this goes all the way down to the batteries. I feel like we're working on that.
Yeah, one of the things I'll mention is that we've had a lot of discussion with regulators about the standards that exist, and RTCA DO311A is an important one. That has a lot of requirements for abuse testing on charging and discharging of the batteries and abuse of battery management systems, and then even an assumption that the battery will go into thermal runaway, and that's a contained and safe event when it happens. And so I know that our company, I think most of the legitimate folks that are working in this space are going to embrace that kind of approach. And I think it is a much more stringent approach than what we've seen in the early implementations where, for a glider, for example, propulsion is not really a critical item. However, when you create batteries that can catch on fire in the glider, that becomes a critical item. So hopefully that part of the industry maybe takes a look at standards like 311A and better approaches. I know companies like Pipistrel, early on, they've got an all-electric trainer, and they've gone down a path of DO311A testing, and they in fact used the Appendix C method, which was setting off two adjacent cells into thermal runaway and showing containment. And when you talk to those folks, there is a need to, by the way, Terry, to update 311A. I think there's some really good stuff we could do. One of the tests that our friends at Pipistrel have tongue-in-cheek mentioned that needs to be included is what they call the Goldfish Test. And that is when you take one of your batteries and throw it into a pool of goldfish and see if the goldfish survive or don't survive based on the path of the electricity in submersion. So poor goldfish, but maybe RTCA should look at that as well.
And if I may build on a little bit as well. So the gentleman asked, about standards and differences in hardware. Another thing we have to think about as an industry is mixed equipage, not just necessarily electricity, but communication standards. We've got aircraft that span almost 100 years now. So how are we going to integrate everybody in the same airspace? So I appreciate you bringing that question up before we really got started. That was well placed.
Yeah, it actually fit really well with our first question. along those lines, I'll open it up. Otherwise, I'd like to start with a second question. Anybody? All right. So for the panel, there seems to be a significant activity with many of the standards bodies that are participating in electric and the eVTOL arenas. Do you think that this is a good approach, or do you see a need perhaps for more organization and collaboration between standards bodies? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so to start out, I think absolutely. I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done, and that work needs to happen relatively quickly. So it's going to take an all-hands-on-deck approach. It's not up to one association, one standards body to do all of that work. I think that the industry could benefit and could get a head start with a lot of collaboration, with communication, with prioritization on that work. I think that forming some sort of coalition or something of that nature could really benefit the industry and move things forward in a faster pace.
I think my comment on this would be that this is an area of emerging activity. So we kind of find ourselves at a time where traditional aviation is really maturing and doing very well. And we have this kind of outgrowth that has a lot of legitimacy, and it could also suffer a lot of consequences if it's not well thought out. I think it's a great place for standards. And so we're starting to see the standards bodies all jump in and want to take on different pieces. From the standpoint of the aviation community, I think what serves us the best is to have that be done in an organized fashion. I think groups like GAMA need to go and approach the standards bodies and have them focus in areas where they're going to provide the most efficient path for standards. What we don't need is duplication. What we don't need is conflicting standards. And so that's going to take some coordination. I don't think in the 1920s, I don't think there was a lot of standards bodies developing aviation standards at that time. Maybe there's some AN standards coming online. But it's an important thing for us to think about. We're in kind of rarefied air at the moment, and we need to focus on that, I think.
I would just add that I think as an industry, the onus is on us also to provide basically the catalog of issues and do a lot of the legwork, because just as somebody who came from the UAS space into the UAM space, one of the things that I was struck by was kind of that lack of a shared understanding of the universe of open challenges. Incredibly knowledgeable people, and I think probably Greg is one of the most expansive here, but not everybody can be inside Greg's brain, so that's a limited resource. But that lack of a shared understanding of the universe and who is peeling off what piece is something that has to be informed by the industry needs. And right now, because of the number of different EVTOL companies, I think it's been a big challenge both on the regulatory side and both on the standard setting body side to understand the signal to noise and really understand where their time and resources are best invested. So I laud the work that Uber's doing to convene folks next week at Uber Elevate. But I also think that there should be other major market players helping to kind of convene the conversation around what is going to be an immediate driver of the market. And make sure that we triage the issues before they then work their way up into the bodies and the associations.
It's hard to follow all that, but to pull it all together, I think using these standards bodies, as for example RTCA, in the area in which their expertise is best known. One of the biggest challenges to not just UAM, but UAS is communication. So defining a standard by which we can all communicate mixed equipage vehicles, manned and unmanned operations, and traditional aviation that's in place today. Making sure that we keep each other abreast of what we're doing is essential. Otherwise, we're going to have some significant issues to deal with. So I'd rather get ahead of that. And groups like RTCA, with their expertise in communications and setting those standards, that's extraordinarily important to us. So I think we should use the groups where their strengths lie and keep everyone coordinated.
Historically, we've tried to lump pilot training and aircraft into tightly defined buckets, okay, or categories. We've done this for the last almost 100 years. It's clear that we're already blurring the lines between those historic buckets, not just between, say, helicopter and aircraft or fixed wing, but now it's manned and unmanned. And the many different kinds of aircraft that are already on the drawing board, it's phenomenal the number you put up, Mike, and their associated training needs. So over the next 10 years, do you see us being able to leverage the old way, or can you maybe speculate on where we need to go in terms of pilot training, aircraft certification, that type of thing?
So I'll touch on this a little bit, I think. So first of all, if you look at a Piper Cub and if you look at a Boeing 787, those are both called airplanes, but they couldn't be farther apart, I think. Yep. And so, the classification of what we call the vehicle is not so critical. We're fortunate to live in 2019 as opposed to 2015 because we're on the other side of a major effort that the regulators around the world have gone through in Part 23. FAA Part 23 has been amended to include a performance-based set of rules. EASA CS23 has been amended in a similar fashion. So have the Canadian, the Brazilian, the Chinese rules are underway to all match, and to be much more performance-based rules that allow a lot of flexibility in standards. And as a result, that's a big opportunity. Here's an example, when you write a rule that tells you how to do a dynamic seat test and how much deflection and how much absorption should happen during that test, that can only be used so many places. When you update that rule to say that the safety objective is to protect the occupants at 1.3 VSTOL, that is a much more broad scenario that can apply to a lot of vehicles. And so that's the nature of the changes that happen in Part 23, and they give us the opportunity for volumes of standards. So we have this opportunity to sit down and develop lots and lots of activities. I think one of the things that we need to think about in this room is how do we react in a more dynamic way. I love some of the products that have come out of RTCA. I think the revision to DO 178 has been wonderful, and I think it took about 10 years. Isn't that right? It took about 10 years. I think we need to continue to push. This industry is going to move very quickly, and I promise you there's not 10 years to wait for another revision of standards like that. I would also bet that 80 to 90% of the work was done in the first year, and we spent the next 9 debating the last 5 to 10%. And so there are areas where we need to parse this work out and do a better job, and I think I'm a big advocate of that. But we're fortunate that classification of these vehicles, I know in our case at Joby, I think in the case of Embraer as well, I'll speak for you at this point, Doug, I think many of us around the table are saying these aircraft actually fit the airplane model really well. They have some additional features. They have electric propulsion. The good news is the new Part 23 addresses that. It includes those features. It includes those issues. It's actually the only regulatory part that does. You can't do electric in 27 or 29 or 25 without special conditions or exemptions, but you can do it in 23. So that's a really interesting space. It will certainly grow into 25, 27, 29. I think we need to look at updating those regulatory areas. Some of the folks that have looked at this have said maybe we need to actually just morph them into 23. So I think there's some interesting opportunities out there.
And if I can build on a little bit as well. So in addition to the rewrite of 23 and the advantages that brought, let me be clear. The FAA has been a great partner as we're moving forward on this. So whether it was Boles' office, with the Small Aircraft Directorate and or folks at Eurocontrol and just worldwide standards bodies have been very open. They've said, come tell us what you want to do and show us how you're going to do that, and we'll work with you. Instead of necessarily sticking to, well, we've never done it that way. It's been a very open and collaborative relationship. And you guys are, I don't know how much you've been following this space, but these are aircraft. I mean, they work with the same principles as other aircraft. They behave differently. Some of them are controlled in different and new ways. So looking at how those standards are brought to bear, whether it's training or actually flight operations, these vehicles will require a different type of pilot. In some cases, they're much more simple to operate. Trajectory-based operations are actually more like flying a video game than actually flying a conventional aircraft. So looking at how we address the pilot training conundrum, we need lots of pilots in a relatively short period of time. and we need them to be durable. So, and they should be able to fly a variety of vehicles. It's a challenge that's interesting. It's keeping us very engaged.
Yeah, I think that's a good segue into what we see as a limiter to our growth. We aren't working with new airframes. We're working entirely as we launch our service with existing helicopters that have their own challenges. But one of the big challenges is that if our service is successful and that we're able to actually prove that we can do the hard work of connecting people from A to B and all the logistics involved in that, one of the biggest limiters is just going to be co-locating lots of really experienced helicopter pilots. I mean, if you're just working within the existing framework today and you want to credibly tell people it's okay, it's safe to fly in our helicopter, well, one of the things you really ought to do is have some very experienced helicopter pilots. Until we bring additional automation and additional technology into some of the existing light helicopter airframes, that's one of your best bets for helping to ensure that you're going to hit the level of safety that we want, which is ultimately to be as safe as commercial aviation. And it is, that presents an interesting challenge when you really get down to the granular level of specific light helicopters and who has lots of hours. And we did an interesting business case, which all of a sudden surfaced certain recruiting hotspots as the Gulf of Mexico and Southeast Asia, which it was not what I anticipated. But that particularity of a problem, I think, will help bring focus to this broader question. If we can serve up to the FAA and to the European regulators specific examples of how this is putting pressure on the market today, and then how we can use some of these incremental changes to build towards a standard simplified vehicle operation model, I think that'll make what it seems like a really big challenge, translating your pilot requirements to something that looks more like a video game operation, hopefully make that a little bit more of a digestible process.
So I think that this is an exciting opportunity, actually, because one of the challenges the entire aviation industry is facing is one with workforce. So you have all of these folks who will be retiring from jobs. I think the average age of ATP-rated pilots is something around 51 years of age, which sounds really young to me as I'm approaching that age. But I think it's a great opportunity for the industry to think differently and to look at how we can utilize the cadre of pilots who are going through training right now. Aviation schools have record enrollments. We can have those folks transition into an organized training that prepares them then for the next step of their flying career, which at some point in time, all of the products we're talking about today likely will be flown without pilots, will be autonomous flight. Well, these folks are going to want jobs and job security, so let's create a career path for them. I think the other side of it, though, is that for urban air mobility truly to be successful, we need to proactively work towards understanding within the current pilot population of how everything is going to work in airspace. So I think that's another role that we can play with respect to training, is to leverage the knowledge that will be gained from airspace integration work that's done through standard setting, through regulatory processes, et cetera, and use forums like this, NBAA's convention, other trade shows, AOPA's outreach, so that we can ensure that we're getting the message out that this is a great thing for the aviation industry, and we should all be supporting this so that everybody's together lockstep.
Bill, I'd actually, before we get too far away from what you shared, you're actually giving us some lessons learned. Are there, because you're operating with this model today using existing helicopters, are there any lessons learned any more lessons learned that you could share with us going as far as if we're adding a substantial number of aircraft to the airspace, or what's working, what looks like it may not work at a certain point? And I don't know if you're to that point where you could share.
I guess this is the challenge of being in semi-stealth mode as a tech company. So there are limits to what I can disclose, but I can say that without revealing, I guess, where we're going to launch in our first market and the exact timing. In our beta that we've done so far, one of the things that's really been, I think, gratifying is how robust the current system is. That the current system can actually handle significant increases of activity in particular areas. And We're based in Los Angeles, so we do our testing of our experimental vehicles, and we've tested certain aspects of the service in areas that have some really congested and challenging airspace. I mean, LA, I think, is the #1 destination, or it's the airport that has the most final destinations and trip origins, I believe, in the United States and possibly the world. And so there's a lot of people who are trying to fly in and out of LA, and that airspace is not necessarily the easiest to navigate. It's also crowded for lots of other reasons. There's an active general aviation population, what our pilots like to call the folks in from Vegas who aren't necessarily paying attention to anything except the Hollywood sign. And active tours, and then of course all the other kind of urban aviation that you see today, besides tour operators, emergency vehicles, it being LA, a super abundance of traffic helicopters. And so the fact that the current system is robust enough to handle really meaningful contributions there, I think it's a validator of our thesis, which is that we can prove a lot about what's going to be a real limiter to this industry before we get to the point of making the real significant asks that we're going to have to make to the FAA and to others, which again goes back to that complementarity. If we can serve up a lot of data, if we can provide a lot of case study information to regulators, that makes it easier for them to digest, the first step on the path to a fully autonomous EVTOL. I think that's a great value to the entire industry.
Yeah, to me it sounds like it's something that is important for flight standards and air traffic, both organizations to kind of watch and understand.
And I will just add also, I think, a point that often gets overlooked in fora like this, but perhaps is front of mind coming from the drone perspective. I can tell you there are few things in the world that people hate more than helicopters, if they're not flying in them. And that's not usually entirely unreasonable. The other thing that they possibly hate more when it flies over them is a drone. But what that speaks to is the fact that you need to engage the communities where you're operating, and you need to address the fact that oftentimes urban aviation, if you look at the urban centers around the United States, has a checkered past, or has the experience has been one where the aviation world didn't necessarily integrate so well with the community. That's a challenge, but I also think it's a great opportunity. It's a great opportunity for us to reset that conversation and then lay a new groundwork for how we're going to interact with urban environments. And I'll tell you, the appetite is there conceptually. It's been really refreshing talking to folks around the United States. I've talked to dozens of mayors who immediately see the value of the service like Skyrise and the value of urban air mobility. And when you talk them through some of the challenges, for instance, what happens when you try to permit a heliport. I don't know if anyone in the room has recently been attempted to permit a heliport. No? Good. Well, then you have had a happy past few years. Because if you were permitting a heliport, you wouldn't have had a happy past few years. But going right at those challenges, that's super important, I think, for us to think of not just everything that's happening at the federal level, everything that's happening at the standards level and the certification level, but at the end of the day, these things have to land somewhere, and in order for that to be effective, you got to start to think orthogonally about how your system interacts with the rest of transportation on the ground.
Great, thanks. This might be a good time to pause and see if we have any questions.
There's been various conversation today about segregated versus integrated airspace. And there were some intriguing comments made about needing to move to a dynamic airspace structure during the UAS panel. And I'm just curious what all of you feel, whether or not that's really necessary for UAM, and how do you see the airspace integration piece evolving?
Well, I'll just hit that one right on the head. So we just released a paper last week called Flight Plan 2030, where we've given out our perspective of how this is going to work over the next decade. For those that don't know, Embraer doesn't just build aircraft, we also manage airspace in other countries. So we have a great relationship with ANSPs around the world. So we've at least tendered our ideas of this. It's out there on the web. I invite you to take a look at it. It's not very long. but it gives a great overview of how we see this moving forward. As I mentioned earlier, this isn't just an exercise for us. There are, as Mike mentioned, there are a lot of entrants into this space. It's extremely exciting. The technology, the overlap with capabilities, the material science, it's kind of, it's almost overwhelming some days when you read some of the press releases. But there are a large number of companies that are looking at this from a holistic perspective, which is what we're doing, and looking at it from, as Bill mentioned, the way people see helicopters today is directly influencing our maneuvers with user experience. So we've spent almost 2.5 years just talking to cities and occupants and first responders and school teachers, folks that we live with every day. And we want to know how they perceive this. Is it something they'll use? Is it something that's going to scare them? Is this a useful business model for the next 10 years, or is it going to take a generational change? So we spent a lot of time looking at this, and as a result, it's influenced every decision that we've made, whether it's the vehicle or airspace or the way we service customers today.
Now, I may regret doing this, but I wasn't sure that you necessarily answered the question about how you guys feel about dynamic airspace.
We love it. Yeah. In fact, I'm glad you brought that up because, look, dynamic airspace requires a lot more than just air traffic management, right? It requires collaboration amongst vehicles, amongst networks, amongst operators themselves, the ANSPs, drones, every occupant of the airspace. In fact, as Eric was talking about at lunch, and I have the benefit of living in Melbourne, you can tell when a rocket launch is going to happen because nobody's flying. And I'm right in the middle of Florida Institute of Technology School and Embry-Riddle. I mean, when the skies go quiet, you wait and you'll see something big go up. So that's not an ideal environment for any of us. In order for this to be economically viable, the airspace must be dynamic, and it must be maneuverable as a dynamic airspace.
So I might jump in because I feel like part of this is we're still putting things in buckets. So we're just looking at the UAVs as their own entity, and yet really when we talk about urban air mobility, a lot of those concepts are pilotless. So where does the line? I mean, what we really have is a continuum of machines that all need to operate in the same airspace. And I think that's where the dynamic is a must. You can't bucket things anymore. It's just a bunch of gray area. It is kind of where we're headed, is what it looks like to me.
Yeah, and I don't want to pick a fight about this necessarily.
Bring it on.
No, but I do think that my only hesitation to be gung-ho on dynamic airspace is that we have a lot of predicates as an industry that we've got to satisfy before we realize the big vision for urban air mobility. So one of the things that we at Skyrise are trying to do is try, again, to push the limits of what the current framework will allow. And I mean that holistically. Because you can look at places where you see lots of urban aviation flights today, and the limiter isn't, I mean, in some cases, I know you've had this experience. In some cases, there may be the airspace, dynamic airspace is a limiter. But the ones that stick out to me are things like in East Hamptons and the North Shore route. They're issues like Nevada and Arizona have experienced when, tour season really spins up. I mean, there are all sorts of other areas that we can solve for, perhaps in parallel as we work towards the long-term future of dynamic airspace. But I just want to make sure that we're sequencing them and we understand which are the blockers that we need to work on most immediately.
That's a really good point. And to your question, dynamic airspace isn't a switch that we're going to flip. It's an iterative process. And today, folks, I mean, for those who are not pilots, most of everything we need to be successful, I mean, as Bill can point out, it exists now. We have infrastructure, we have regulatory policy, we have the tools and the training to make this work. It's viable. It's being done today. But building towards a future where we have lots of different vehicles that want to occupy closer and closer performance-based spacing, it's going to require a shift in the way that we manage traffic. And And that's some of the things that we cover in our paper and that we look forward to working on. But that requires a collaborative approach. That's all of us together, right?
Maybe to wrap up this portion of the conversation, I would say that today the urban air mobility community hardly exists, right? And we have a very long-term classic general aviation, commercial aviation, and military aviation industry out there. So trying to suppose that something needs to change for us that don't yet exist is probably not appropriate. So I think most of the companies that we've seen around the table are looking to fit into the traditional infrastructure, and we kind of think that over time, with success, we can do things that help everybody, that make it more accessible for everybody to make their missions and to adopt technologies in a progressive way that's a positive way versus coming in and trying to change the system. I feel the conversation's gotten very positive. If we were sitting here 5 years ago, we'd be hearing about drones, and the statement from most of us in the traditional aviation world would have been, keep them out of our way,
right,
and don't make me do anything to equip for them, right? And now I think we're starting to hear we need to integrate those aircraft into the rest of the system, right? We're starting to hear those kind of conversations. And I think we all see that aviation will become more of the part of lives of many. So today, I hate to say this, but we are a niche. We are an obscuration in the world, right? We are not mainstream. Most people understand Delta Airlines or United. That is their exposure to aviation. There's obviously a lot more to it. However, it's a tiny slice in the pie of their life. And all these things that we're talking about really grow the exposure of traditional aviation into the lives of the populace, and that's really good. It means that the burdens of regulation, the burdens of infrastructure get shared by many, many more, and it helps everyone succeed. So I hope that's where we're headed with this.
Do we have any other questions? All right. So I'd like to hit, we're about T-minus 10, and I'd like to hit with the last question because it may carry. But so the next panel is going to be discussing the same topic, but it's an opportunity for our regulators to weigh in on their views of the future of urban air mobility. What I'd like is for each of you to state a key need or one of the critical issues you think the U.S. regulators need to address in the next 2 to 5 years, and then also maybe long-term over the next 10 years to facilitate the safe introduction of the types of transportation we're talking about. And I'm going to let you start, Mike.
All right, thanks, Lowell. I think that safe integration is the key to all of this. And from my perspective, I very much would love to have an exciting EVTOL aircraft to take me from my home in Falls Church, Virginia, to my office at Metro Center in Washington, D.C., and home every single day, whether that's through a shared structure or whether it's my own personal vehicle. Either one would work well for me. But while I want that today, I really want that to be safe. I want the aircraft to be safe. I want the operations to be safe. I want everything about it to be safe, first and foremost. So I think that from my perspective, personal perspective, and also from the business aviation industry perspective, is that safety is going to be paramount. And I know that many of the companies that are developing eVTOL products, programs, looking at the operations of them, have safety first and foremost, and I think that that's the right order. And I have a high degree of confidence that our regulators will keep that focus there as well. So that would be my answer, not just for 2 to 5 years, and but from today all the way through well into the future.
Bill?
Yeah, I'd say path predictability, if that's the thing that I can ask for. And by that I mean 2 things. One is path predictability when you're trying to bring new technologies to market. Obviously, there's a lot of different platforms that people are contemplating flying. At Skyrise, our technology is focused on existing airframes and bringing new levels of automation to those airframes to make them safer, to fly more effectively. And so for us, especially at a time when I think some of the challenges that Boeing has faced recently has cast a bit of a cloud over how predictable the next 5 years are going to be for bringing iterative levels of automation into other parts of aviation. I think path predictability is really important. And I will just give you an anecdote of being on a phone with a prospective investor who actually asked for some kind of assurance that on our tech roadmap, that we wouldn't see a major shift from FAA or EASA that would disrupt our certification plan, because you have a steady incremental develop of the technology. And folks who are willing to make long-term bets also want to see that there's a long-term path for their capital to be deployed and generate the return that they're looking for. The other side of path predictability is that we can actually grow this market. And so that's some predictability that cities will incrementally become more comfortable expanding the number of places where you can actually take off and land. And on that, I know that the panel after us isn't a panel of mayors, but I'd love to see federal regulators take a more proactive role to broker some of the conversations in areas that are going to see lots of traffic and demonstrate a little bit more dynamism than we see under the current noise regime. And there's a lot of room, I think, there for positive interaction that will give some certainty for companies that from the federal, state, and local level, folks are going to incrementally provide more predictability that you'll be able to scale your operations. So path predictability would be my key ask. And I will say also, I should call out a number of folks at the FAA have been doing great work. Mike Romanowski and his team. I know that Peter White in Boston is aggregating a bunch of best practices. I mean, literally between January and today, it's already many levels more gratifying to interact with the FAA than it was over the 3 years when I was interacting on the drone side. So I see a ton of positive momentum there. So that's an ask and a compliment.
Well, that kind of ties right into what I was going to ask for, and that's to maintain the openness and maybe help spread that out across the organization. So not necessarily just the FAA. The guys have been fantastic to work with, as you mentioned, Peter White's group and Rick Domingo's and Mike Romanowski, but helping to spread that out across all regulatory bodies. That openness to look at things from a new perspective. You know, a lot of the conversation today hasn't been about some emerging technology. It's been applying technology that's been in work for the last few decades in new ways. And so we're seeing that openness to the new technology. And I would just ask that they continue to do so. I think that's probably the key element that we need to be successful.
And I guess to wrap up the question, from my detailed view of things, I think there are no more physical constraints that are going to prevent these activities. I think they're absolutely solid engineering solutions to all the challenges. I think the FAA has their head around 85% of those, and the last 15% we're going to get there in the next year or so on how we show that those solutions are safe and viable for transportation. The integration of these vehicles into commercial operation and then into the airspace is an area where I think the conversations have not matured enough. And so we're starting to now have some good dialogue with the flight standards team that Rick and I know they've just appointed Rob Duffer to be the conduit for urban air mobility activities. That's wonderful. And then the air traffic side of the FAA talking about the true, how do we fit these in? How do we deal with things like the anemic nature of electrical energy, right? So every time we take off, we can't say, I'm in a fuel emergency because I have 45 minutes left, right? So we have to figure out how to deal with, you know, when I fly today, what should be a 10-minute flight if I'm IFR can easily turn into 45 minutes if I'm put on a hold and then put on the full procedure, right? So those kind of things would be pretty nerve-wracking if you're in an all-electric vehicle. So we need to work on some of those issues as well.
Hello, Jeff Geraci from ACR Electronics. Do you really think you're going to stay rolled up under Part 23 and that you won't have your own part as you move forward and have more aircraft in the air? Additionally, if you look at Sao Paulo, it has the largest density of EVTOL. Do you need that kind of density for the economics to be good? I know LA, I'm from Miami area, and that definitely could use it. And or are you just building sexy aircraft and hoping for the best? What do your economics look like?
So I'll touch on the 23 question, and we can definitely
Go
talk
right
about
ahead.
economics as well. So from a do we really think these vehicles would fit into 23, or do we need something else? I think that there are a range of things we've seen out there. So you can look at what a Volocopter has put on the table. That doesn't look exactly like an airplane to me. That's something slightly different. But you can look at something like some of the Uber concepts, or I'm not going to tell you what my vehicle looks like. We're still in very, very stealth mode. But you could look at maybe something like what my colleague here has put on the table, and those are much more airplane-like. They fly on a wing, they perform like an airplane, they climb like an airplane. And when we've done the analysis, about 80% to 90% of the Part 23 rules fit very well, and there's about 10% special condition gap. And in fact, so ASTM is the means of compliance for many of the new Part 23 rules. Those line up pretty well too. Things like structures, things like propulsion. It's the exception where it doesn't. We have some areas of performance because some of these take off and land vertically in addition to forward. It's things like crashworthiness vectors, so there's more of a down vector potentially and a forward vector. And then some of the areas of electric propulsion do fit perfectly in 23, but means of compliance need to be developed. So I think from that perspective, it's interesting. And as I hand it off for the last question about the business model, I think what's most interesting here is not selling these vehicles as much as it is operating, because when you look at the economics of these vehicles, maintenance costs and energy costs is very, very low compared to what, and not early on. I imagine early on we'll have the teething issues, but in the long term, you have very few moving parts. In many of these motors, you have one moving part, one bearing, that can make it lots and lots of hours on the orders of 1 million. And then you have batteries that probably need to get replaced, and then a lot of solid state equipment. And so maintenance could get very, very cost effective, which means that person that's operating that aircraft is going to make the profit. And so I think that's a very interesting dynamic to this part of the equation.
That's a perfect segue. So to your business question, all I need is a detailed list of everything you don't know about, right? And to your point about the DOCs and the MOCs being very low, they are, especially when you compare them to traditional aircraft today. If you look at an executive jet, some of the older models, it's 1-to-1 man hours to flight hours in terms of maintenance. Very, very cost ineffective. That's obviously gone down over time. We're looking at tiny fractions of that, which drive costs and make the business much more viable. But and I think Bill, I'm going to hand it off to you here in just a second because Bill's got some practical experience with this right now. What we're seeing is that the market is changing so much, and the way that energy is managed, that we flow to the vehicles themselves, is changing. So it's not necessarily difficult to predict, but finding that right model, it's very dynamic. However, I can tell you this: if it wasn't economically viable, we wouldn't be sitting up here talking about it right now.
I guess you have to hand it off to me, huh? All right. So I will say yes.
We're out of time, so
I'll keep it brief.
Yeah.
As a venture-backed company, I can guarantee you that there are a lot of economic models that are very attractive. I think that the biggest challenge that we're going to face is one that doesn't require the future to come to pass. It's the operational efficiencies that challenge all transportation companies. So operating this as a service means that you're going to be subject to all the same kinds of things that affect Uber and Lyft, that affect Via, that affect a variety of other different companies who are trying to load multiple people in a vehicle. Think Scoop, which does commuter carpooling. So it's that universe of people who are solving this type of question that we look to when we think about the business model. It's not a one-to-one relationship, and many of those still have a lot of open questions as to how they can be successful. But if you drill into Uber's business model, you drill into Lyft, you find areas where there are very successful parts of the business. And that's why I think we'll start with a very iterative approach on the business model side for urban air mobility as well. We want to be ubiquitous, but certainly I think we're going to have the opportunity to capture a meaningful, profitable business that we can grow and expand as new platforms make it more affordable and more accessible to all.
Thanks, Bill. So we're out of time. I want to thank my panel members. You guys, I really appreciate it.
It's been a pleasure.
Great
Thank you guys very much.
Thank you, Will.
And thank you, everybody.